The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico Territory, 1877, as Virgil Blackett pulled his dun stallion to a halt outside the saloon. Exhaustion weighed on him after 3 weeks driving cattle from Texas, but something caught his eye in the narrow alley between the general store and the blacksmith shop movement that seemed too desperate to ignore. Virgil dismounted, his spurs jingling against the hard-packed dirt as he approached the alley. His hand instinctively hovered near the Colt revolver strapped to his hip. The territory was still wild, and caution had kept him alive for 26 years. What he found stopped him cold. A young woman, perhaps 20 years of age, was digging through a refuse pile behind the general store. Her once fine dress was tattered and filthy, her dark hair matted and unkempt. Despite her condition, there was something about the determined set of her jaw that struck him. This wasn't a common vagrant. There was pride in her posture, even as she searched for scraps. "Madam," Virgil called softly, not wanting to startle her. She whirled around, a half-rotten apple clutched in her dirt-stained hand. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and defiance, startlingly blue against her dirt-smudged face. "I am not stealing," she said, her voice carrying a hint of Eastern refinement despite its hoarseness. "Mr. Peterson throws these out anyway." Virgil raised his hand slightly. "I never said you were." He noticed a bruise darkening her left cheek, partially hidden by her hair. "Are you hurt, miss?" "I am perfectly fine." She straightened her back, dignity clinging to her like the last clean patch on a soiled garment. "Please go about your business." Instead, Virgil took a step closer. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" The woman's stomach betrayed her with an audible growl. She flushed with embarrassment but held his gaze. "That's hardly your concern, sir." "Name's Virgil Blackett. I've just finished a cattle drive and was about to get some dinner at the hotel. They serve a decent steak." He gestured toward the modest establishment down the street. "I'd be honored if you'd join me." Suspicion flashed in her eyes. "What do you expect in return, Mr. Blackett?" "Nothing but conversation, madam. Been talking to cows and cowboys for 3 weeks straight. Wouldn't mind some civilized company for a change." He offered what he hoped was a reassuring smile. She studied him for a long moment, weighing hunger against caution. Finally, she dropped the rotting apple. "Katherine Addington," she said, extending a grimy hand with surprising formality. "I accept your invitation, Mr. Blackett, though I'm hardly fit for public dining." Virgil removed his bandana and offered it to her. "For your hands and face, if you'd like. There's a water pump behind the hotel." 10 minutes later, Katherine looked marginally more presentable. She'd washed her face and hands and attempted to smooth her hair. The dress remained tattered, but there was nothing to be done about that. The hotel dining room was sparsely populated, with just a few travelers and a pair of businessmen hunched over documents in the corner. The hostess, a plump woman named Mrs. Holloway, raised an eyebrow at Katherine's appearance but showed them to a table when Virgil fixed her with a stern look. "Order whatever you like," Virgil said once they were seated. Katherine scanned the simple menu, her hands trembling slightly. "The beef stew, please," she told the waiter who appeared at their table. "And water." "Same for me," Virgil said, "and coffee for both of us if the lady would like some." Katherine nodded gratefully. When the waiter departed, silence fell between them. Katherine kept her eyes lowered, her posture rigid despite her obvious exhaustion. "You're not from around here," Virgil observed, breaking the tension. She glanced up. "No, I'm from Boston originally." "Long way from home." "Yes." Her voice was clipped, discouraging further questions. Virgil respected her reticence and changed the subject. "Truth or Consequences is an unusual town. Used to be called Hot Springs until a few years back. named for the mineral springs nearby. Good for what ails you, they say. The arrival of coffee provided a welcome distraction. Katherine wrapped her hands around the warm cup, inhaling the steam with closed eyes. "How long have you been in town?" Virgil asked gently. Katherine took a sip before answering. 3 weeks. I was traveling west with companions. There was a disagreement, and I found myself without funds or transportation. The careful way she phrased it told Virgil there was much more to the story. Their stew arrived, thick and aromatic. Katherine lifted her spoon but paused, seemingly overwhelmed by the sight of proper food. Then, with deliberate control, she began to eat slowly, though Virgil could see it cost her tremendous effort not to bolt the meal. "I'm a cattle man," Virgil offered, giving her time to eat. "Just brought a herd up from Texas, planning to winter here before heading back in the spring." Katherine nodded, listening but focused on her food. By the time she'd finished, some color had returned to her cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Blackett," she said formally. "Your kindness will not be forgotten. Virgil, please." He leaned back in his chair. "Do you have lodgings for the night, Miss Addington?" Her expression closed off immediately. "I'll manage." "There's a widow, Mrs. Carpenter, who rents rooms on Copper Street," Virgil said carefully. "Clean, respectable place. I'd be happy to advance you a week's rent." "I do not accept charity, Mr. Blackett." Her voice was ice. "Not charity. A loan, if you prefer. Or perhaps an arrangement. Mrs. Carpenter often needs help with her bookkeeping and correspondence." Katherine hesitated. "You seem very familiar with Mrs. Carpenter's affairs." "She's my aunt," Virgil admitted with a slight smile. "My mother's sister. She came out west after her husband died in '65. "I see." Katherine studied him. "And she would accept a stranger on your word alone, she would." "She's a good judge of character." Virgil settled their bill with the waiter. "What do you say? It's getting dark and the nights are cold here." The struggle was visible on Katherine's face, pride battling necessity. Finally, she nodded once, a sharp downward jerk of her chin. "A loan, then. I will repay every cent." They walked the 3 blocks to Mrs. Carpenter's boarding house in the gathering twilight. Katherine kept a careful distance between them, her arms wrapped tightly around herself against the evening chill. Virgil noted how she scanned each side street and alleyway as they passed, like prey watching for predators. Mrs. Carpenter was a tall, angular woman with Virgil's same sandy hair, though liberally streaked with silver. She answered the door with flour-dusted hands and suspicious eyes that softened when she recognized her nephew. "Virgil, I thought you'd be wallowing in whiskey with those ruffians you call a crew tonight." Her gaze shifted to Katherine, assessing but not unkind. "Evening, Aunt Louise. This is Miss Katherine Addington. She's new in town and needs lodging. I told her you might have a room available." Mrs. Carpenter's shrewd eyes took in Katherine's tattered dress and proud bearing. "I do have 1 room left, as it happens. Come in, both of you." The boarding house was modest but immaculately kept, with polished floors and simple furnishings. A lamp burned in the small parlor, casting warm light over a collection of well-worn books and a basket of mending. "Miss Addington is from Boston," Virgil explained as Mrs. Carpenter led them inside. "Educated, I suspect, and perhaps could help with your correspondence and accounts in exchange for room and board until she gets settled." Katherine shot him a look of surprise, but didn't contradict him. "Is that so?" Mrs. Carpenter turned to Katherine. "Can you cipher and write a legible hand?" "Yes, madam," Katherine replied. "I was trained in both as well as bookkeeping." Mrs. Carpenter nodded thoughtfully. "I could use such help. My eyes aren't what they once were, and the territorial taxes get more complicated every year." She gestured toward the stairs. "The room is small but clean. $5 a week, including breakfast and supper." "That seems fair," Katherine said quietly. "Though I should tell you, Mrs. Carpenter, I have no possessions beyond what you see and no funds at present. Virgil will vouch for you, I expect, Mrs. Carpenter raised an eyebrow at her nephew. "I will," he confirmed. "I'll advance the first month's rent." "That won't be necessary," Mrs. Carpenter said. "A week to start, and we'll see how the arrangement works out. I'll need an hour each morning and evening for the books and correspondence." Katherine nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Carpenter. Your kindness is appreciated. Not kindness, girl, practical business." The older woman turned toward the kitchen. "You look half-starved. I've just taken bread from the oven. Come have some with butter before you retire." When Mrs. Carpenter disappeared into the kitchen, Katherine turned to Virgil. "You did not need to intervene so thoroughly in my affairs." "No," he agreed, "but my aunt's a fair woman who could use the help, and you looked like you could use a safe place to sleep." Katherine's expression softened slightly. "Thank you, I will repay your loan." "No rush." Virgil moved toward the door. "I'll let you get settled. My aunt's bread is worth staying for." "Mr. Blackett, Virgil," Katherine stopped him. "Why did you help me?" Truly, Virgil considered the question. "My pa always said you measure a man by how he treats those who can do nothing for him." He tipped his hat. "Good night, Miss Addington. I hope you find some peace here." "Katherine," she corrected softly. "Good night, Virgil." As he walked back toward the hotel where he'd taken a room, Virgil found himself thinking about Katherine Addington's startling blue eyes and the quiet dignity she maintained, even while searching through garbage. There was a story there, probably not a happy one, but Virgil had seen enough of life to know that sometimes a person's past was best left undisturbed until they chose to reveal it. He'd check on her in a few days, he decided, just to make sure she was settling in. 3 days passed before Virgil returned to his aunt's boarding house. He'd been busy settling his cattle in the valley pastures he'd leased for the winter and paying his crew their wages before most scattered to saloons and brothels or headed home to families. It was mid-afternoon when he knocked on Mrs. Carpenter's door, his hat in hand and his boots freshly polished. The door opened to reveal Katherine, looking remarkably transformed from their first meeting. Her dark hair was neatly pinned, and she wore a simple blue dress that must have been one of Mrs. Carpenter's, altered to fit her smaller frame. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a yellowish shadow, and her face had filled out just enough to soften the sharp angles of hunger. "Mr. Blackett," she said, clearly surprised to see him. "Please come in. Mrs. Carpenter is at church but should return shortly." Virgil followed her into the parlor, noting how she moved with more confidence now. "I came to see how you were settling in, actually." "Very well, thank you." Katherine gestured for him to sit. "Your aunt has been most kind, though she would insist it's merely practical business." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "That sounds like Aunt Louise," Virgil agreed, settling into a straight-backed chair. "She runs this place like a general commanding troops. She mentioned you'd be in town through winter." Katherine took a seat across from him, her posture perfect but less rigidly defensive than before. "That's the plan. Got 400 head of cattle fattening up in the valley. Come spring, I'll drive them to the railroad at Santa Fe." "It seems a hard life," Virgil shrugged. "It's what I know. My father was a cattleman before me and his father before that. We've been driving herds since before Texas was a state. Mrs. Carpenter mentioned your parents are gone." "Pa died 5 years ago. Heart gave out after a cattle drive. Ma followed a year later. Folks said it was pneumonia, but I reckon it was more that her reason for living was gone." Katherine nodded, understanding in her eyes. "They had a true marriage then." "The truest I've seen," Virgil confirmed. "Together 30 years and still looked at each other like newlyweds." He studied her for a moment. "And your family, Are they still in Boston? Katherine's expression clouded. My parents died in a fire when I was 16. I was taken in by a family friend. The careful way she said it made Virgil suspect this friend was at the root of her current troubles, but he didn't press. I'm sorry for your loss. It was some time ago. She straightened her skirts, clearly wishing to change the subject. Would you care for coffee? I've just brewed some. That would be welcome. As Katherine rose to fetch the coffee, the front door opened, and Mrs. Carpenter bustled in, followed by a tall, distinguished-looking man in his 50s wearing an expensive suit. Katherine, dear, you'll never guess who I encountered at church. Mrs. Carpenter stopped short when she saw Virgil. Oh, nephew, I didn't know you were calling today. Just stopped by to see how things were going, Virgil replied, standing, the man behind Mrs. Carpenter stepped forward, his focus entirely on Katherine, whose face had gone pale. Katherine, the man said, his voice cultured but cold. What an extraordinary coincidence. Katherine's hands tightened on her skirt. Mr. Hargrove, I was not aware you had business in Truth or Consequences. I have business wherever you are, my dear. Hargrove smiled thinly. Mrs. Carpenter was just telling me about her new boarder who arrived from the East. I knew immediately it must be you. Mrs. Carpenter looked between them, confusion evident. You know each other. Mr. Hargrove was my guardian after my parents died, Katherine explained, her voice wooden. Until I reached my majority last year. Virgil noticed how still Katherine had become, like a rabbit freezing before a predator. His instincts sharpened. Katherine, I've been searching for you since you left Denver, Hargrove said, ignoring the others. You can't imagine my distress when you disappeared from our hotel. I left a note, Katherine replied. I believe I made my wishes clear. Hargrove's face hardened momentarily before smoothing into practiced concern. You were distraught, confused. That dreadful fever you suffered in Cheyenne affected your judgment. He turned to Mrs. Carpenter. The poor girl has been unwell. I've been pursuing her for weeks, terrified for her safety. Mrs. Carpenter frowned. She seems perfectly lucid to me. The delusions come and go, Hargrove said smoothly. Katherine, gather your things. We'll depart immediately for Denver, where you can receive proper care. Katherine's voice was surprisingly steady when she spoke. I am 21 years old, Mr. Hargrove, and no longer your ward. I have no intention of accompanying you anywhere. Hargrove's pleasant mask slipped further. Don't be foolish. You have no means to support yourself. Your reputation is already compromised by your adventures. Come with me now, and we'll speak no more of this unseemly episode. Virgil stepped forward. The lady said no. Hargrove assessed Virgil with cold disdain. This is a private matter, sir. It doesn't concern you. I'm making it my concern. Virgil moved to stand beside Katherine. Miss Addington has employment and lodging here. She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go. Employment, Hargrove laughed. As what? A serving girl? A laundress? Katherine was raised for better things. Her father was one of Boston's most respected merchants before his unfortunate demise. I'm Mrs. Carpenter's assistant, Katherine said, and I find the work both useful and satisfying. Hargrove's expression darkened. This is absurd. You belong in society, not scraping by in some dusty frontier town. I'm offering you comfort, security, a position appropriate to your breeding. You're offering me a cage, Katherine replied, her voice stronger now. As you have since the day my parents died and you took control of their estate, my inheritance, which you've systematically depleted while keeping me dependent on your generosity. Mrs. Carpenter gasped softly. Hargrove's face reddened. You ungrateful little, he caught himself forcing a smile. Katherine, you're upset. These wild accusations only prove my point about your mental state. He reached for her arm. Virgil stepped between them. I believe it's time for you to leave, Mr. Hargrove. Get out of my way, cowboy. Hargrove's cultured veneer had completely slipped now. This woman is coming with me one way or another. I've invested too much to lose her now. Invested? Mrs. Carpenter echoed sharply. The girl isn't livestock, sir. Katherine moved to Virgil's side. I will never go with you, Mr. Hargrove. Never. Our association ended when I came of age, and no amount of threats or manipulation will change that. Hargrove's eyes narrowed dangerously. You think this desert nobody can protect you? I have connections in every territory. One telegram, and I could have you both ruined. This nobody has connections too, Virgil said evenly. Starting with Sheriff Mendoza, who I played poker with last night. He'd be mighty interested in hearing how you've been mismanaging your ward's inheritance. A tense silence filled the room. Finally, Hargrove straightened his jacket with precise movements. This isn't over, he said to Katherine. A woman alone in this wilderness won't survive long. You'll come crawling back to civilization soon enough. He turned to Mrs. Carpenter. Madam, I apologize for the disturbance. With that, he strode out, slamming the door behind him. Katherine sagged slightly once he was gone, and Virgil placed a steadying hand on her elbow. Are you all right? He asked quietly. She nodded, though her face remained pale. Yes, thank you. Mrs. Carpenter bustled to lock the door. That man is no gentleman, appearances notwithstanding. She turned to Katherine. My dear, I think we need to hear the full story now. Katherine took a deep breath. Yes, I believe you do. Over the next hour, as they sat with coffee growing cold, Katherine unfolded her tale. After her parents died in what she now suspected was not an accidental fire, Hargrove, her father's business partner, had been appointed her guardian. He had controlled her inheritance, doling out just enough for her to maintain appearances while systematically looting the estate. When she reached 21 and should have gained control of her remaining fortune, he had taken her west, claiming business interests required his presence in Denver. There, he had introduced her to society as his ward while pressuring her to marry him. When I refused, he became unpleasant. Katherine touched the fading bruise on her cheek. He kept me virtually prisoner in our hotel, claiming I was suffering from mountain fever and needed constant supervision. One night, I managed to slip away while he attended a business dinner. I took what money I could find in his room and purchased passage on a stagecoach heading southwest. But the money ran out, Virgil surmised. Katherine nodded. The stage was robbed near Las Cruces. The bandits took everything of value from the passengers. I continued on to Truth or Consequences because it was the next stop, but I had nothing left. No money, no references, not even a change of clothing. And that's when Virgil found you, Mrs. Carpenter concluded. Yes, Katherine looked at him with undisguised gratitude. I had been surviving on what I could find or beg for 3 days. I was desperate. Mrs. Carpenter reached over to pat Katherine's hand. Well, you're safe now. Hargrove has no legal claim on you, and he'll find this town less receptive to his type than he might expect. He's not a man who gives up easily, Katherine warned, and he has powerful friends. So do we, Virgil said. Truth or Consequences might be small, but people look out for their own here. I'm hardly one of your own, Katherine pointed out. Mrs. Carpenter snorted. You're under my roof and in my employ. That makes you family enough for this town. Virgil stood. I'll have a word with Sheriff Mendoza this evening. Hargrove won't get far if he tries anything illegal. And if he tries something legal, Katherine asked. He could claim I'm mentally unfit or that I stole from him when I fled. Then we'll face that together, Mrs. Carpenter said firmly. Now, no more talk of that dreadful man. Katherine, would you help me prepare supper? Virgil, you'll stay, of course. It wasn't a question. Virgil smiled at his aunt's commanding tone. "Yes, madam." As the women moved toward the kitchen, Virgil caught Catherine's eye. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I think you're the bravest person I've met in a long while." A flush of color touched her cheeks. "Hardly brave, just desperate." "Sometimes those are the same thing," he replied. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, or the first tendrils of trust taking root. Later, as Virgil walked back to his hotel, he realized with startling clarity that he would do whatever necessary to keep Katherine safe. It wasn't just about protecting a woman in distress anymore. In the span of a few hours, it had become personal. Hargrove made his next move faster than any of them anticipated. The following morning, Virgil was at the livery stable checking on his horse when Sheriff Mendoza sought him out. "Blackett," the lawman called, his expression grim beneath his thick mustache. "Got a situation you should know about." Virgil straightened from where he'd been examining his stallion's hoof. "Morning, Sheriff. What kind of situation?" Mendoza glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "That fancy Easterner who arrived yesterday, Hargrove. He's filed a formal complaint claiming a young woman named Katherine Addington stole valuables from him in Denver and ran off. Says she's mentally unstable and needs to be returned to his care for her own protection." A cold anger settled in Virgil's gut. "That's a load of horse manure, and you know it." "I don't know anything of the sort," Mendoza replied mildly. "Never met the woman, but I do know you vouched for her to your aunt, and Louise Carpenter isn't one to take in strays without good reason. Katherine was Hargrove's ward until she came of age last year. He's been stealing her inheritance and tried to force her to marry him. When she refused, he became violent." Virgil gestured to his own cheek. "Left marks on her. She escaped with nothing but the clothes on her back." Mendoza sighed heavily. "That complicates matters. He's got papers, Virgil. Telegrams from Denver and Boston attesting to her condition and his legal right to oversee her affairs due to mental incapacity." "Forgeries or bought testimonials," Virgil snapped. "She's as sane as you or me." "Maybe so, but Hargrove's got Judge Wilson half convinced. You know how Wilson gets around men with money and Eastern connections. Keeps hoping one of them will recommend him for the territorial Supreme Court." Virgil swore under his breath. Wilson was the only judge for 50 miles and notoriously susceptible to flattery from social betters. "What's Hargrove's play here?" Virgil asked. "He's requested a hearing this afternoon. If Wilson rules in his favor, he can legally take the woman back to Denver." Mendoza shook his head. "Thought you should know, given your interest in the situation. Appreciate it." Virgil secured his horse's stall and grabbed his hat. "I need to warn Katherine and Aunt Louise." "Hearings at 2 o'clock, Mendoza called after him. "Town Hall." Virgil found Katherine in Mrs. Carpenter's small garden behind the boarding house, hanging laundry on a line. The domestic seen Katherine with a clothespin between her teeth. Reaching up to secure a sheet struck him as both incongruous and fitting. She looked more at home here than he imagined she ever could in some stuffy Boston parlor. "Katherine," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "Virgil, good morning." Her smile faded as she registered his expression. "What's happened?" Quickly, he explained Hargrove's maneuver and the impending hearing. Katherine's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "I expected something like this. Hargrove is nothing if not persistent." "We need to prepare a defense," Virgil said. "Character witnesses, evidence of your competence." "Judge Wilson is impressionable but not completely corrupt." "Will it matter?" Katherine asked bitterly. "A woman's word against a respected businessman, an Eastern gentleman versus a penniless runaway." "You're not alone this time," Virgil reminded her. My aunt is respected in this town, and I've got some standing with the ranchers and merchants." Mrs. Carpenter emerged from the house, drying her hands on her apron. "I heard voices." She stopped when she saw their grave expressions. "What's happened now?" After Virgil repeated the news, Mrs. Carpenter's face hardened with resolve. "That snake. Well, he won't find us unprepared." She turned to Katherine. "First, we need to establish your identity and competence beyond question. Do you have any documentation at all? Letters from before your parents died?" "Anything with your family seal or signature?" Katherine shook her head. "Nothing. Hargrove kept all my papers for safekeeping." "Of course he did," Mrs. Carpenter muttered. "Well, then we need to demonstrate your mental acuity and education." She thought for a moment. "Mr. Peterson at the bank knew your father, didn't he? He mentioned once that he'd done business with Addington Mercantile in Boston," Katherine confirmed. "Good. We'll start there. And Judge Wilson's wife fancies herself a cultured woman, always showing off her knowledge of literature and music. Katherine, you're educated in those areas." "Yes, I had extensive tutoring in both." "Excellent. We'll make sure Mrs. Wilson has a chance to speak with you before the hearing." Mrs. Carpenter was fully in her element now, strategizing like a general. "Virgil, speak with Mendoza. See if there's any way to delay the hearing until we can gather more support." As his aunt continued outlining their plan of action, Virgil watched Katherine's posture gradually straighten, hope rekindling in her eyes. She wasn't giving up without a fight, and neither were they. By 1:30 that afternoon, a small crowd had gathered outside the town hall, a simple clapboard building that served as courthouse, meeting place, and sometimes church. Word had spread quickly about the Easterner trying to claim the new young woman at Mrs. Carpenter's boarding house. Katherine wore Mrs. Carpenter's best dress, a somber navy blue that lent her an air of dignified maturity. Her dark hair was swept up in a modest style, and she carried herself with the poise of the well-bred young woman she was. Inside, Judge Wilson sat behind a table on a slightly raised platform. At 55, with thinning gray hair and perpetually furrowed brows, he projected an air of judicial gravity that belied his flexible ethics. His wife, a pinch-faced woman with pretensions to refinement, sat in the front row. Hargrove was already present, looking confident in an expensive suit, his lawyer somehow procured in the tiny town on short notice beside him. He smirked slightly when Katherine entered with Virgil and Mrs. Carpenter. "All rise," called the bailiff, a former cowboy named Tucker who doubled as Mendoza's deputy. "This special hearing is now in session, the Honorable Judge Wilson presiding in the matter of the guardianship of Katherine Addington." Judge Wilson peered over his spectacles at the assembled parties. "This is a most unusual proceeding," he began. "Mr. Hargrove has petitioned this court to recognize his guardianship of Miss Katherine Addington, claiming she is mentally unfit to manage her own affairs and has absconded with valuable property. Before we proceed, I should like to hear from Miss Addington herself." Katherine stepped forward, her chin held high. "Your Honor, I am of sound mind and legal age. Mr. Hargrove was indeed my guardian until my 21st birthday last year, after which his legal authority over my person and property ended. I left Denver of my own free will to escape his unwanted advances and controlling behavior." Hargrove's lawyer, a thin man named Perkins, rose immediately. "Your Honor, we have documentation from respected physicians in Denver attesting to Miss Addington's delusional state following a severe fever. Her accusations against Mr. Hargrove are symptomatic of her condition." Perkins approached the judge's table with a sheaf of papers. Wilson examined them with a frown. "These appear to be in order," he murmured. "If I may, Your Honor," Mrs. Carpenter interjected, rising from her seat. "I have employed Miss Addington as my assistant for the past week. In that time, she has demonstrated exceptional competence in bookkeeping, correspondence, and household management. I find no evidence whatsoever of mental impairment. With respect, Mrs. Carpenter," Perkins countered, "you are not a medical professional, and a week is hardly sufficient time to assess someone's mental state, particularly when dealing with a condition that presents with periods of lucidity interspersed with delusion." Virgil stood next. "Your Honor, when I first encountered Miss Addington, she was indeed in distress, but from hunger and exposure, not mental illness. She has conducted herself with dignity and intelligence under extremely difficult circumstances." Judge Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "While I appreciate the character testimonials, they don't outweigh the medical documentation. If I may, Your Honor," Katherine interrupted, her voice clear and controlled, "I request the opportunity to demonstrate my mental competence directly. Mr. Hargrove claims I am delusional and incapable of rational thought. I invite any test of my faculties you deem appropriate." Wilson blinked in surprise. "That's an unusual request. Perhaps Mrs. Wilson could assist," Katherine suggested, nodding toward the judge's wife. "I understand she is highly educated in literature and the arts. She might pose questions that would reveal any deficiency in my education or reasoning." Mrs. Wilson sat up straighter, clearly flattered. Judge Wilson hesitated, then nodded. "Martha, would you be willing to assist the court in this matter?" Mrs. Wilson rose with obvious pleasure. "I would indeed, Herbert." She turned to Katherine with a somewhat predatory smile. "Miss Addington, are you familiar with the works of Shakespeare?" "Quite familiar," Katherine replied. "I've studied all 37 plays and the sonnets." "Then perhaps you can identify this passage. 'The quality of mercy is not strained, it droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath.' The Merchant of Venice, Act Roman 4, Scene 1, Katherine answered promptly. Portia's speech to Shylock, arguing for mercy over strict justice. It continues, "It is twice blessed, it blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest, it becomes the throned monarch better than his crown." Mrs. Wilson looked momentarily discomfited, then rallied. "And in music, can you identify the composer who wrote the Moonlight Sonata?" Beethoven. Piano Sonata No. 14 in C-sharp minor, composed in 1801. For the next 10 minutes, Mrs. Wilson posed increasingly difficult questions about literature, art, music, and even mathematics. Katherine answered each one correctly and articulately, occasionally expanding on her answers with insightful commentary that left Mrs. Wilson looking increasingly impressed. Finally, Judge Wilson cleared his throat. "I believe we've established that Miss Addington is well educated, Martha." "Thank you. She is indeed," Mrs. Wilson agreed, giving Katherine a nod of approval before returning to her seat. Hargrove had been watching with mounting frustration. "Education is not the same as sanity, Your Honor. Many brilliant minds suffer from delusion. Miss Addington's particular illness manifests in paranoid fantasies about those closest to her, specifically me, her loyal guardian who has only ever acted in her best interests." "Mr. Hargrove," Katherine said, turning to face him directly, "when did this supposed fever and resulting delusion begin?" Hargrove blinked at being addressed so directly. "In Cheyenne, approximately 2 months ago." "And yet," Katherine continued, "I've here a letter you wrote to me on my 21st birthday, nearly a year ago." She withdrew a folded paper from her pocket. "A letter in which you acknowledge I am now legally independent, but express your hope that I will continue to rely on your guidance." Would you care to explain why you would write such a thing to someone you claim has been under continuous guardianship due to mental incapacity?" A murmur ran through the courtroom. Hargrove's face darkened. "Where did you get that?" he demanded. "It was in my personal correspondence case," Katherine replied. "The one item I managed to keep with me when I fled. You may examine the handwriting and signature, Your Honor. They are unmistakably Mr. Hargrove's." Judge Wilson accepted the letter, studying it carefully. "This does appear to contradict your claim of ongoing guardianship, Mr. Hargrove." Hargrove conferred hastily with his lawyer, who looked increasingly concerned. "Your Honor," Perkins said finally, "my client wrote that letter before Miss Addington's condition manifested." He naturally acknowledged her legal majority at the time, but circumstances changed when her health deteriorated. "Then why not petition for guardianship renewal through proper legal channels?" Katherine challenged. "Instead, Mr. Hargrove chose to isolate me in Denver, hundreds of miles from anyone who knew me in Boston, and began pressuring me to marry him, giving him permanent legal control over both my person and my remaining fortune." Judge Wilson frowned. "These are serious allegations, Miss Addington." "They are the truth, Your Honor," Katherine said firmly. "And I believe Mr. Peterson of the First Territorial Bank can provide further corroboration." Mr. Peterson, a stout, balding man who had been sitting quietly at the back of the room, stood. "I can indeed, Your Honor. I received a telegram this morning from my colleague at First Boston Bank confirming that Miss Addington is the sole heir to Addington Mercantile, a significant enterprise with holdings valued at over $50,000. The bank also confirms that withdrawals and transfers from the Addington accounts over the past 5 years have been substantial and signed for by Mr. Hargrove as guardian." Hargrove stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. I've managed those funds responsibly for Katherine's benefit." "Is that why my quarterly allowance kept decreasing?" Katherine asked quietly. "Is that why, when I asked to review the accounts last year, you claimed the records were too complex for my feminine understanding?" The courtroom had grown very quiet. Judge Wilson removed his spectacles and polished them thoughtfully. "Mr. Hargrove," he said finally, "I find Miss Addington's testimony compelling and your claims increasingly questionable. Your medical documentation, while official in appearance, is contradicted by both the evidence of my own observation and the testimony of respected members of this community." He replaced his spectacles and sat up straighter. "This court finds that Katherine Addington is of sound mind and legal age, and therefore no guardianship is warranted. Furthermore, I am referring the matter of the Addington estate management to the territorial prosecutor for investigation of possible financial impropriety." Hargrove's face contorted with rage. "You backwater simpleton! Do you have any idea who I am, who my associates are?" "You are currently in contempt of this court," Wilson replied coldly. "Sheriff Mendoza, please escort Mr. Hargrove to your office until he calms himself." As Mendoza moved forward, Hargrove's hand darted inside his jacket. Before anyone could react, he had produced a small pistol, aiming it directly at Katherine. "You ungrateful little witch," he snarled. "If I can't have what's mine by law, I'll take it another way." Several things happened at once. Mrs. Wilson screamed. Judge Wilson ducked behind his desk. Virgil lunged toward Katherine, shoving her aside just as Hargrove fired. The bullet missed Katherine but grazed Virgil's shoulder, tearing through his shirt and drawing a line of fire across his flesh. Despite the pain, he tackled Hargrove, driving him to the floor as Mendoza and Tucker rushed forward to help. Katherine's scream of "Virgil" cut through the chaos as Hargrove was disarmed and restrained. "It's nothing," Virgil assured her as she knelt beside him, her face white with fear. "Just a scratch. You could have been killed," she whispered, pressing her handkerchief to the bleeding wound. "Wasn't about to let him hurt you," Virgil replied, wincing as he sat up. "Not after all the trouble we went to proving you're worth protecting." The look she gave him, then a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and something deeper that neither was ready to name, stayed with him long after Doc Henderson had cleaned and bandaged his wound, long after Hargrove had been locked in the jail to await transfer to the territorial prison, long after the excitement in the small town had begun to subside. Something fundamental had changed between them in that moment of danger, something neither of them could ignore, even if they weren't quite ready to acknowledge it. The weeks following Hargrove's arrest brought significant changes to Katherine's circumstances. Telegrams to Boston confirmed her identity and legal rights to her family's estate. While the full recovery of her inheritance would take time and legal proceedings, Mr. Peterson arranged for an advance against her assets, allowing Katherine to purchase proper clothing and personal necessities. Despite her improved financial situation, Katherine chose to remain at Mrs. Carpenter's boarding house, continuing her work as the older woman's assistant. She had found unexpected contentment in the simple routines of the boarding house and genuine friendship with Mrs. Carpenter. She also found herself spending increasing time with Virgil as his shoulder healed. At first, their encounters were brief and seemingly coincidental, Virgil stopping by to check on his aunt, Katherine delivering baked goods to the ranch hands at his leased pasture. But soon, they established a pattern of evening walks along the quieter streets of Truth or Consequences, their conversations growing deeper and more personal with each meeting. One crisp November evening, as they strolled past the small church toward the edge of town, Katherine gathered her courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. "What happens when spring comes?" she asked, her breath forming small clouds in the cooling air. "When you drive your cattle to Santa Fe." Virgil was silent for a moment, his face thoughtful in the fading light. "Normally, I'd head back to Texas afterward, start preparing for next season's drive." "Normally," Katherine repeated, her heart sinking despite her efforts to remain pragmatic. Virgil stopped walking and turned to face her. "But I've been thinking maybe it's time for a change." "What kind of change?" Katherine asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "I've been working cattle since I was old enough to sit a horse," Virgil said. "It's a good life, but a lonely one. Spending months on the trail, sleeping under the stars sounds romantic until you've done it 20 seasons running." He took her gloved hand in his. "I've put aside enough over the years to buy a spread of my own. Was thinking about looking at some land around here. Truth or Consequences is growing. Good water, decent grazing. Could build something permanent." Hope flickered in Katherine's chest. "You'd stay in New Mexico." "I might," Virgil said, his eyes holding hers, "if I had sufficient reason." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. "Virgil," Katherine began hesitantly, "I don't want you to change your plans on my account. I know how important your work is to you." "Katherine," he replied, his voice gentle but firm, "you're more important. These past weeks, getting to know you, it's changed something in me. Made me want things I never thought much about before. A home, a family, a partner to share it all with." Katherine's breath caught. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I'm falling in love with you," Virgil admitted plainly. "And I hope you might feel something similar for me." "I do," Katherine whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I've tried to be sensible about it, to remind myself that such feelings are impractical, that we've known each other only a short time. But the heart doesn't always listen to sensible arguments," Virgil finished for her, a smile warming his features. "No, it doesn't." Katherine returned his smile, her earlier fears melting away. "So what do we do now?" Well, I reckon we keep getting to know each other through the winter, Virgil suggested, resuming their walk with her hand still clasped in his. I'll look at land options. You can decide if you want to stay in Truth or Consequences or return to Boston once your inheritance is settled. I have no desire to return to Boston, Katherine said firmly. There's nothing for me there but painful memories. Then we have time to figure things out, Virgil said. No need to rush into anything. Katherine nodded, but a part of her already knew what she wanted a future with this man who had saved her in more ways than one. Not just from hunger or from Hargrove, but from the loneliness and fear that had been her constant companions for too long. As if reading her thoughts, Virgil stopped again beneath the spreading branches of an old cottonwood tree. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down and brushed his lips against hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Katherine responded with a sureness that surprised them both, her arms sliding around his neck as the kiss deepened into something warm and promising. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Virgil rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he confessed. "I've been hoping you would," Katherine replied, a new boldness in her voice. They walked back to Mrs. Carpenter's boarding house hand in hand, their future unfolding before them like the wide New Mexico sky, vast with possibility and bright with hope. Winter settled over Truth or Consequences, transforming the landscape with occasional dustings of snow that rarely lasted more than a day or two. The town prepared for Christmas with simple decorations and planned celebrations, a far cry from the elaborate festivities Katherine had known in Boston, but somehow more meaningful in their authenticity. Katherine found herself busier than ever, beyond her work for Mrs. Carpenter. She had begun assisting Mr. Peterson at the bank 2 afternoons a week, her knowledge of bookkeeping proving valuable during the end-of-year accounting. The modest salary supplemented her funds while the legal proceedings regarding her inheritance continued in Boston. Virgil, meanwhile, had been investigating available properties in the surrounding area. 2 weeks before Christmas, he rode into town with news that couldn't wait for their evening walk. Katherine was just leaving the bank when she spotted him dismounting in front of Mrs. Carpenter's boarding house, his face alight with excitement despite the cold. "Virgil," she called, hurrying toward him. "You weren't expected until tomorrow," he grinned, taking her hands in his. "Couldn't wait, I found it, Katherine, the perfect place." "The Robertson property?" she asked, referring to a ranch they had discussed previously. "No, something better. The old Miller homestead about 5 miles south of town. 200 acres with water rights to Thompson Creek, a solid house that needs some work but has good bones, and even a small apple orchard." Katherine's eyes widened. "It sounds wonderful. When can I see it?" "Tomorrow, if you're willing to ride out with me." His expression grew more serious. "There's something else I want to ask you, Katherine, something important." Her heart quickened. "Yes." Virgil glanced around at the busy street. "Not here. Tonight after supper," Katherine nodded, curiosity and anticipation fluttering in her chest. "Yes, of course." That evening, after they had helped Mrs. Carpenter clear away the supper dishes, Virgil suggested a walk despite the chilly temperatures. "Are you certain?" Katherine asked, noting the frost already forming on the windows. "We could talk in the parlor." "I'd prefer the privacy," Virgil admitted, "and I've never minded the cold." Bundled in their warmest clothes, they set out toward the small park at the center of town. The night was clear, stars glittering overhead in a vast canopy, their breath forming clouds in the still air. When they reached a bench beneath a bare-branched elm, Virgil gestured for Katherine to sit, then lowered himself beside her. "Katherine," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "when I found you that day behind the general store, I had no idea how completely you would change my life." She smiled, remembering. "I was terrified you were going to report me for stealing garbage, and I was thinking you were the proudest, most dignified woman I'd ever seen, even in those circumstances." He took her hand, his expression solemn in the moonlight. "These past months, getting to know you, your strength, your intelligence, your kindness, I've fallen completely in love with you." Catherine's breath caught. Though they had acknowledged growing feelings for each other, neither had spoken the word love so directly before. "I love you too, Virgil," she whispered, the words feeling right and true. He smiled, relief and joy washing over his features. "Then I have a question for you." Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a small box. "I know it's soon, some might say too soon. But when you know something's right, waiting seems foolish." Catherine's heart pounded as Virgil slid from the bench to one knee before her, opening the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "Katherine Addington, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of building a life with me on that land I told you about, making it into something that's ours together." Tears welled in Catherine's eyes, not of sadness but overwhelming joy. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and certain. "Yes, Virgil Blackett, I will marry you." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, catching the moonlight in brilliant sparks. "It was my mother's," he explained softly. "My father gave it to her when they had nothing but dreams and each other. Aunt Louise has been keeping it for me." "It's beautiful," Katherine said, examining the ring with wonder. "And even more precious knowing its history." Virgil rose and sat beside her again, gathering her into his arms for a kiss that sealed their promise to each other. When they parted, Katherine rested her head against his shoulder, contentment washing over her like a warm tide. "When shall we marry?" she asked. "As soon as you like," Virgil replied. "Though I'd understand if you wanted to wait until your inheritance is settled." Katherine shook her head. "I don't need my inheritance to know I want to be your wife. Let's marry after Christmas, before you need to start preparing for the spring cattle drive." "You're sure? It won't be an easy life, especially at first. That house needs work and ranching has good years and bad." "I'm sure," Katherine said firmly. "After everything I've been through, I know what matters. Not money or social position, but building something real with someone I trust and love. Someone who sees me for who I truly am." Virgil tightened his arm around her. "I see you, Katherine. And I promise to keep seeing you, every day for the rest of our lives." They returned to the boarding house to share their news with Mrs. Carpenter, who feigned surprise despite the knowing smile that suggested she had been expecting this development. "Well, it's about time," she declared, embracing them both. "I was beginning to think I'd need to lock you two in the cellar together to get you to make it official." The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Truth or Consequences, bringing congratulations and offers of help with the wedding and their future home. Katherine and Virgil settled on a January 15th wedding date, allowing time for the holiday celebrations to pass and for preliminary work to begin on the house at the Miller property, which Virgil purchased with savings and a modest loan from the bank. On the morning of their wedding day, Katherine stood in Mrs. Carpenter's guest room, which had become her home these past months, gazing at her reflection in the mirror. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant, a cream-colored gown with delicate lace trim that Mrs. Wilson and several other town ladies had helped create. Her dark hair was arranged in soft curls, topped with a small circlet of winter berries and evergreen. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Carpenter said from the doorway, her usual briskness softened by emotion. "Like you've finally found where you belong." "I have," Katherine agreed, turning to the woman who had become like family to her. "Thank you for everything, Louise, for taking me in, for believing in me, for helping me find my strength again." Mrs. Carpenter waved away her gratitude. "You always had strength, girl. You just needed a safe place to remember it." She straightened Katherine's collar with maternal care. "Now, are you ready to marry that nephew of mine?" "More than ready," Katherine replied, her smile radiant. The ceremony took place in the small church, which had been decorated with pine boughs and candles for the occasion. Nearly everyone in Truth or Consequences attended, filling the simple wooden pews to capacity. Even Sheriff Mendoza had abandoned his usual stoic demeanor for a rare smile. When Katherine entered on Mr. Peterson's arm, who had graciously offered to stand in for her absent father, she had eyes only for Virgil, waiting for her at the altar. He looked handsome and somewhat uncomfortable in his new suit, his usually windswept hair tamed for the occasion. The moment their eyes met, everything else faded away: the murmurs of the congregation, the minister's solemn greeting, the cold January air seeping through the church's old windows. There was only Virgil, the man who had found her at her lowest moment and seen her true worth beneath the dirt and desperation. Their vows were traditional, but spoken with deeply personal meaning. When Virgil promised to cherish and protect her, "until death parts us," Katherine heard not the possessive declaration of ownership that Hargrove had offered, but a pledge of partnership and devotion that left her eyes shimmering with tears. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Virgil's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, drawing appreciative chuckles from the assembled guests. The celebration afterward at the town hall was jubilant, with tables laden with food contributed by what seemed like every household in Truth or Consequences. There was dancing to music provided by local musicians, speeches from well-wishers, and more genuine warmth than Katherine had experienced in all her years in Boston society. Late in the evening, as they prepared to depart for their new home, Mrs. Carpenter pressed a package into Katherine's hands. "Wedding present," she explained gruffly, "from me and a few others who have grown fond of you." Inside was a handmade quilt, each square contributed by a different woman from the community: Mrs. Wilson, Mrs. Peterson, the ladies from the church auxiliary, and others Katherine had come to know during her months in town. "It's tradition," Mrs. Carpenter explained. "Each piece represents a wish for your marriage: happiness, prosperity, children, endurance through hard times." Katherine traced the intricate stitching, deeply moved by the acceptance she had found in this small frontier town. "It's beautiful. Thank you, all of you." Their departure was accompanied by cheers and good-natured teasing as Virgil helped Katherine into the wagon that would take them to their new home. The Miller property, now the Blackett Ranch, awaited them, the house prepared as much as possible for their arrival with basic furnishings and a well-stocked pantry. As they drove away from town, Katherine nestled against Virgil's side for warmth in the cold night air. "Happy, Mrs. Blackett?" he asked, the new name still sounding wonderfully strange and right. "Completely," she assured him, gazing up at the stars that seemed to have multiplied since their first evening walk together. "If someone had told me 6 months ago that I would be here now, married to a cattle rancher in New Mexico territory, starting a new life so far from everything I knew, I would have thought them mad." "Life takes unexpected turns," Virgil agreed. 6 months ago, I was planning another lonely winter before the spring drive, with nothing much to look forward to but the routine I'd always known. And now," he smiled down at her, his expression visible in the moonlight, "now I've got everything to look forward to. Building our ranch, making that house into a home, maybe starting a family when we're ready." Katherine's heart swelled at the thought. Children, she murmured. I'd like that someday. Someday, Virgil agreed, when we're settled. For now, I'm just looking forward to being alone with my wife. The heat in his voice sent a pleasant shiver through Katherine that had nothing to do with the January cold. They arrived at the ranch house, a solid two-story structure of adobe and timber that needed repairs, but was fundamentally sound. Virgil had spent the past weeks replacing broken windows, fixing the roof, and ensuring the fireplace was safe for use. Inside, lamps had been lit earlier by one of Virgil's ranch hands, casting a warm glow over the simple furnishings. Following tradition, Virgil lifted Katherine into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackett," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the main room. "Home," Katherine repeated, looking around at what would be their parlor once properly furnished. Already she could envision the changes they would make together: curtains at the windows, comfortable chairs before the fireplace, perhaps a piano someday when her inheritance was settled. But those were concerns for the future. Tonight was for beginning their life together as husband and wife, for discovering each other in new ways, for cementing the bond that had begun in an unlikely meeting behind a general store. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their new bedroom, Katherine marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From the privileged but unhappy young woman in Boston to the desperate creature picking through trash, to this loved, cherished, and finally free to build the life she wanted. "What are you thinking about?" Virgil murmured, his arm tightening around her waist. "About how fortunate I am," Katherine replied, turning to face him in the darkness. "How one terrible moment led to the best decision of my life, which was taking a chance on a kind cowboy who offered dinner instead of judgment." She traced his features with gentle fingers. "I love you, Virgil Blackett." "And I love you, Katherine Blackett," he replied, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "Now and always." As spring approached, the Blackett ranch began to take shape. Katherine and Virgil worked tirelessly to transform the neglected property into a working cattle operation and a comfortable home. The house gradually filled with furniture, some purchased in town, some crafted by Virgil's own hands, and some sent from Boston as Katherine's inheritance matters were slowly resolved. In late February, Katherine received word that Hargrove had been convicted of fraud and attempted murder, sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. The news brought closure to that chapter of her life and freed her to focus fully on the future. By March, the apple trees in the small orchard were beginning to bud, promising fruit later in the year. Katherine had established a kitchen garden near the house and was planning to add chickens and perhaps a milk cow to their growing collection of livestock. Virgil divided his time between preparing for the upcoming cattle drive to Santa Fe and making improvements to their property. He had hired 2 permanent ranch hands, brothers named Tom and Jim Harper, who had worked previous drives with him, and was training a local boy, Miguel, as an apprentice. The evening before Virgil was to depart with the cattle, they sat together on the porch swing he had built for Katherine as a surprise, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. "I wish you didn't have to go," Katherine admitted, her head resting on his shoulder. "Me too," Virgil replied, "but it'll be the last long drive for a while. Once we get this herd to market, we'll have enough to really build up our own stock. Next year we can focus on our own ranch." Katherine nodded, understanding the economics of their situation. "I know. And it's only for a few weeks. Tom's wife will be checking in on you and the Harpers will keep the place running." Virgil tightened his arm around her. "Still, I hate leaving you alone." "I won't be entirely alone," Katherine said softly, taking his hand and placing it gently on her stomach. Not anymore. Virgil went very still beside her. Katherine, are you saying, we're going to have a baby? She confirmed, her voice trembling with joy and nervousness. In late October, according to Doc Henderson. Virgil's face transformed with wonder as he turned to face her fully. A baby. Our baby, Katherine nodded, tears of happiness welling in her eyes. Our baby. Are you pleased? Pleased. Virgil laughed, gathering her into his arms. Katherine, I'm overjoyed. A baby, our own family. He kissed her with tender passion, then drew back to look at her with concern. Are you feeling all right? Should you be doing so much work around the place? Maybe I should delay the drive. I'm perfectly well, Katherine assured him, touched by his concern. The morning sickness isn't too severe, and Doc Henderson says I'm healthy as a horse. The drive can't be delayed. We need the proceeds too much. We'll manage until you return. Virgil placed his hand on her still flat stomach again, his expression awed. A baby, he repeated. I'm going to be a father. And you'll be wonderful at it, Katherine said, covering his hand with hers. Just as you are at being a husband. They sat together as darkness fell, planning and dreaming for this new life they had created. Their hopes for the future expanding to include a child who would grow up in the freedom and beauty of the New Mexico territory, far from the constraints that had shaped Katherine's own childhood. The following morning, as Virgil prepared to depart with the cattle herd, he held Katherine longer than usual, reluctant to leave now that he knew she carried their child. I'll be back before you know it, he promised, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Take care of yourself and our little one. Don't overdo it. We'll be fine, Katherine assured him, straightening his bandana with practiced fingers. Just come back to us safely. Always, Virgil vowed, bending to kiss her one last time before mounting his horse. Katherine stood in the yard, waving as Virgil and his men drove the cattle toward the eastern horizon, already counting the days until his return. The weeks of Virgil's absence passed more slowly than Katherine had anticipated, despite her many responsibilities around the ranch. She found herself talking aloud to their unborn child as she worked in the garden or prepared meals, sharing stories about Virgil and her hopes for their future together. Mrs. Carpenter visited frequently, bringing news from town and practical advice about pregnancy and childbirth that Katherine found both reassuring and occasionally terrifying. Tom Harper's wife, Maria, checked in almost daily, her own experience as a mother of 3 making her a valuable source of support. By the time Virgil was expected to return, Katherine's condition was becoming noticeable. A small but definite rounding of her formerly flat stomach that filled her with wonder each time she dressed. She was in the kitchen, preserving the early summer berries that grew wild near the creek, when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Wiping her hands on her apron, Katherine hurried outside, her heart leaping at the sight of Virgil dismounting in the yard. He looked trail-worn and tired, his face tanned even darker by weeks in the sun, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. Katherine, he called, crossing the yard in long strides to sweep her into his arms. She clung to him, breathing in the familiar scent of dust, leather, and the essence that was uniquely Virgil. Welcome home. He drew back slightly to look at her, his gaze dropping to the small swell of her abdomen. You're showing, he said with wonder, placing his hand gently on the curve. Just a little, Katherine agreed. Your son or daughter is making their presence known. Virgil's smile was radiant. You're more beautiful than ever. Later, after Virgil had bathed away the trail dust and eaten a hearty meal at their kitchen table, he shared news of the cattle sale. Got top dollar, he reported with satisfaction. The markets in the East are hungry for beef, and our stock was in prime condition. We've cleared enough to buy that additional grazing land to the west, and still put aside something for the baby. Katherine smiled, enjoying the sound of we and our in his accounting. This was their business, their future, their family growing together. "I've been thinking," she said, pouring him another cup of coffee, "that we might use some of my inheritance when it finally comes through to expand the orchard. Apple trees take time to mature, but they could provide a stable income to complement the cattle operation." Virgil nodded approvingly. "Diversification. Smart thinking, Mrs. Blackett. You've got a good head for business." "I had an excellent teacher in my father," Katherine acknowledged. "Before he died, he was teaching me about the merchant trade. He believed women should understand finance and commerce just as well as men." "A forward-thinking man," Virgil commented. "I wish I could have known him." "He would have liked you," Katherine said with certainty. "He valued honesty and hard work above all else." As summer progressed into fall, Katherine's pregnancy became increasingly evident. By September, she was forced to adapt her clothing and reduce her more strenuous activities around the ranch, though she continued to keep the books and oversee the household with efficient care. The apple orchard yielded its first modest harvest under their stewardship, providing fruit for pies, preserves, and cider that Katherine learned to make with Mrs. Carpenter's guidance. The additional grazing land had been purchased and fenced, allowing them to increase their herd with quality breeding stock. In early October, as Katherine entered her final month of pregnancy, a letter arrived from Boston that would change their circumstances significantly. Her inheritance had finally been settled, with the courts finding in her favor regarding Hargrove's mismanagement. The sum restored to her control was substantial enough to expand their operations considerably if they chose. "We could buy more land," Virgil mused as they discussed the news that evening. "Maybe even build a larger house in a few years when the family grows. Or we could establish a proper apple orchard business," Katherine suggested. "There's increasing demand for fruit throughout the territory, according to Mr. Peterson." They talked long into the night, planning and dreaming, but always with the understanding that their primary goal was not wealth for its own sake, but security and opportunity for their growing family. 2 weeks later, in the pre-dawn hours of a crisp October morning, Katherine woke Virgil with a hand on his shoulder. "I think it's time," she said calmly, though her eyes betrayed her nervousness. Virgil was instantly alert. "The baby, are you sure?" Katherine nodded, one hand pressed to her swollen belly. "My pain started last evening, but I wanted to be certain before waking you. They're coming regularly now, about 15 minutes apart." Virgil leapt from bed, pulling on his clothes with uncharacteristic haste. "I'll send Jim for Doc Henderson and Maria Harper. Just stay calm. Everything's going to be fine." Despite his reassuring words, his hands trembled as he lit the lamp and helped Katherine into a more comfortable position on the bed they shared. The next hours passed in a blur of pain and determination for Katherine as her labor intensified. Maria arrived first, her experienced presence a steadying influence. Doc Henderson followed an hour later, his weathered face showing no alarm as he examined Katherine. "Everything's progressing normally," he assured them. "First babies often take their time, Mrs. Blackett. We just need to be patient." Virgil was banished to the parlor after Katherine entered the most difficult stage of labor, his pacing wearing a path in the rug Mrs. Carpenter had given them as a housewarming gift. The sounds of Katherine's pain tore at his heart, making him feel helpless in a way no cattle stampede or frontier danger ever had. Finally, as the sun was setting, a new cry joined Katherine's, the indignant wail of a newborn taking their first breath. Virgil froze mid-pace, his heart hammering in his chest. A few minutes later, Maria appeared in the doorway, her face tired but wreathed in smiles. "Congratulations, Mr. Blackett. You have a healthy son." Virgil sagged against the wall, relief and joy washing over him in equal measure. "And Katherine, is she all right?" "She's fine, tired, of course, but doing well. You can see them now." Nothing in Virgil's life had prepared him for the sight that greeted him in the bedroom. Katherine, pale but radiant, cradling a small bundle wrapped in the softest blanket they owned. She looked up as he entered, her exhaustion evident but overshadowed by the love shining in her eyes. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Virgil approached the bed with reverent steps, perching carefully beside Katherine to peer at the tiny face nestled against her breast. The baby had a shock of dark hair like his mother's and the ruddy complexion of a newborn, his little features scrunched in what appeared to be deep concentration. "He's perfect," Virgil whispered, one finger gently stroking the infant's cheek. "Absolutely perfect. Would you like to hold him?" Katherine asked. With trembling hands, Virgil accepted the precious bundle, cradling his son with a mixture of terror and adoration. "Hello, little man," he murmured. "I'm your pa." As if in response, the baby's eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing a deep blue that might eventually change but for now mirrored his mother's. "What shall we call him?" Katherine asked, watching the two most important people in her world becoming acquainted. Virgil considered the tiny face. "How about James, after my father, James Blackett?" Katherine tested the name. "It's strong and dignified. I like it." "James it is, then." Virgil carefully returned the baby to Katherine's arms. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For him, for everything you've given me." Katherine smiled tiredly. "We gave each other a new life, Virgil. Now we've created another one together." As darkness settled over the ranch house, the new family of three rested together, the first chapter of their shared story complete and a lifetime of new chapters awaiting them. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons, each bringing changes to the Blackett ranch and family. James grew from a sturdy infant into an active toddler with his mother's thoughtful eyes and his father's adventurous spirit. The cattle operation prospered under Virgil's capable management, while Katherine's expanded apple orchard began to gain regional recognition for its quality fruit. 2 years after James's birth, they welcomed a daughter they named Elizabeth Louise, after Katherine's mother and Mrs. Carpenter. Ellie, as she was soon nicknamed, had Virgil's sandy hair and a determined personality that announced itself from her earliest days. As the children grew, so did the ranch. The original house was expanded to include more bedrooms and a proper study for Katherine, who had taken over most of the business correspondence and financial management. A schoolroom was added when James reached 5, where Katherine taught both her children and occasionally the children of neighboring ranchers. Truth or Consequences grew as well, transforming from a modest frontier settlement into a thriving small town with a proper school, a larger bank, and even a weekly newspaper. The arrival of the railroad spur in 1886 connected the community more directly to distant markets, benefiting both the Blackett cattle business and their increasingly successful orchard enterprise. Through it all, Katherine and Virgil's partnership deepened, their love maturing like the apple trees they had planted in those early years, more firmly rooted with each season, more fruitful with each passing year. On the 10th anniversary of their first meeting, Virgil surprised Katherine with a trip back to Boston. With the children left in Mrs. Carpenter's capable care, they traveled east by train, a journey that took Katherine back to the world she had fled, but now could face on her own terms. Boston had changed less than Katherine herself. The familiar streets and buildings stirred memories, but no longing for the life she had left behind. Instead, She took pleasure in showing Virgil the places that had shaped her early years, her father's old mercantile establishment, now operated by her cousin who had purchased it from the estate, the public gardens where she had walked with her mother, the church where her parents had worshipped. They visited her parents' graves, where Katherine placed flowers and introduced Virgil in silent communion with those who had gone before. Standing beside her husband in the peaceful cemetery, Katherine felt a sense of completion, of circles closing and new ones continuing. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said as they walked back toward their hotel. "I needed to see it all again, to know that I've truly moved forward." Virgil squeezed her hand. "Do you ever regret it, leaving all this civilization for a dusty ranch in the territory?" Katherine stopped walking to look at him directly. "Never. Not for a single moment. Everything that matters in my life began when you found me at my lowest point and offered kindness instead of judgment." Virgil's smile was tender. "Best decision I ever made, stopping to check that alley." When they returned to New Mexico, Katherine brought with her a few treasured mementos from her parents' estate, her mother's favorite books, her father's pocket watch, family photographs that she wanted to share with James and Ellie. But her heart returned wholly to the life and home she had built with Virgil. As they crested the rise that gave them their first view of the ranch, Katherine felt the same surge of belonging she experienced each time she returned from town. The house, solid and welcoming with smoke curling from the chimney, the orchards, now extensive and beginning to blossom with spring's promise, the grazing cattle dotting the expanded pastures, and rushing down the path toward their wagon, two small figures followed by Mrs. Carpenter's more sedate approach. "Mama, Papa," James and Ellie called in excited unison as the wagon drew closer. Virgil barely had time to halt the horses before the children were clambering aboard, full of stories and questions and demands to know what presents had been brought from the mysterious East. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, their rooms strewn with the small treasures Katherine and Virgil had selected in Boston, the couple sat on their porch swing watching the stars emerge in the clear New Mexico sky. "It's good to be home," Katherine sighed, nestling against Virgil's shoulder. "It is," he agreed, his arm comfortable around her waist. "You know, when I found you that day, I never imagined all this." "What did you imagine, honestly?" "Just getting you a decent meal and maybe helping you find work in town. I certainly wasn't planning on falling in love." Katherine smiled in the darkness. "And I was only hoping to avoid arrest for scavenging. Finding a husband, building a ranch, having children, none of that was in my desperate calculations." "Life has a way of surprising you," Virgil observed. "Sometimes for the better. In our case, infinitely for the better." Katherine tilted her face up for his kiss, still feeling after all these years the same flutter of joy when their lips met. Inside the house, a clock chimed 10, the grandfather clock they had purchased with the first significant profits from the apple orchard. The sound reminded Katherine of how far they had come from those early days of careful economies and uncertain futures. "I was thinking," Virgil said as the chimes faded, "that we might build that schoolhouse we've been talking about. Not just for our children, but for all the ranchers' kids in the area. The town school is too far for daily travel for most of the outlying families." Katherine straightened with interest. "A proper school, with a qualified teacher. That's what I was thinking. We could donate the land at the north corner of our property and contribute to the teacher's salary. With your Boston education, you could help develop the curriculum." "Virgil, that's a wonderful idea. Education was so important to my father. He always said knowledge was the one thing that couldn't be stolen or destroyed." "A wise man," Virgil commented. "Like father, like daughter." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the swing creaking gently as Virgil pushed with one foot. "Did you ever imagine," Katherine asked finally, "on that day when you found me digging through trash for food, that we would end up here?" With all this, Virgil considered the question seriously. "No," he admitted, "but I knew there was something special about you even then. Something that made me want to help to know more about you," he chuckled. "Aunt Louise says I fell in love with you right there in that alley. I just didn't know it yet. Your aunt is a very perceptive woman, that she is." Virgil pulled Katherine closer as the night air cooled. "What about you? When did you know you were falling for a dusty cowboy?" Katherine smiled at the memory. "I think it started the night of Hargrove's hearing, when you put yourself between me and his gun without hesitation. But I knew for certain during our walks that fall, when you talked about your dreams for the future, and I realized I wanted to be part of them." "And here we are," Virgil murmured, "living those dreams." "With a few unexpected additions," Katherine added, thinking of their children sleeping peacefully inside. "The best kind of additions." Virgil rose, offering his hand to help Katherine up. "Come on, Mrs. Blackett, tomorrow's going to be a busy day." Hand in hand, they walked into the home they had built together. Their journey from that fateful meeting behind the general store to this moment of contentment, a testament to the power of kindness, courage, and love to transform lives. Behind them, the vast New Mexico sky cradled the ranch in starlight, a silent witness to their continuing story, the story of a cowboy who found a desperate woman picking through trash for food, who took her to dinner, and who ultimately took her forever into his heart and life, creating a legacy of love that would endure long after both were gone.